Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 54 of the Aviation News Talk podcast for a Newsmakers edition, where we talk to people who are making the news. Today, we're doing an update on the proposed privatization of air traffic control here in the U.S. Now, we explained the proposal in detail back in episode 17 last summer by using audio clips from congressional hearings. There have been some recent changes, so it's time to update this important topic. And in a moment, we'll be sitting down with friend of the show, Rob Mark, to help guide us through that discussion. But now stand by, because this Newsmakers edition starts now. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation and the people in our great industry. I'm Max Truscott, and if you're joining us for the first time, we have a weekly show that shares pilot safety tips and general aviation news from around the world. But we also interview movers and shakers in the aviation industry, as we're doing today. Now, earlier this week, I talked with Rob Mark, and I'll share that interview with you in a moment. But first, I want to take a moment to thank the over 100 listeners who support the show each month with a donation through our Patreon site. We don't accept ads for this show, but we do have expenses, so I greatly appreciate those contributions. Now, earlier today, I had an email from a listener who said that he and his wife have a monthly budget for supporting podcasts and that they rotate their contributions among the different shows that they listen to. Now, I thought that was a great idea and would like to suggest that if you've thought about supporting this or other podcasts in the past, please think about adding a line item in your monthly budget for supporting podcasts. Now, it's really easy to get started, and if you do, I'll read your name on the show. Here's all you do. Just tap on the artwork of your podcast app to get to the show notes. And at the bottom of the show notes, you'll see a link that takes you to our Patreon page. And if you're using a podcast app that doesn't display links, well, then just open a web browser, type in aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and it will take you straight to the page. Then click on Become a Patreon and enter the amount you'd like billed to your credit card each month. You can donate as little as $2 a month, though higher amounts give you access to some goodies that you can read about on the site. And while you're on the Patreon site, check out the many general aviation stories I've posted on the blog. Some stories are available for everyone to read, and a few are only viewable by our Patreon supporters. Remember to go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And I picked that name because we have awesome listeners. Now, earlier this week, I talked with Rob Mark to get an update from him on ATC privatization. And I'm excited to have a guest host who happens to be a close friend joining me here today. Rob Mark is uniquely qualified to help. He's the senior editor for Flying Magazine, and he's one of the few people in the world who's worked as both an air traffic controller and an airline pilot. He publishes the Jetwine blog, and he runs Avia, which provides media content for his clients in the aviation industry. Rob, I think this is the third time we've had you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Aviation News Talk podcast. We're excited to have you back again.
Well, thank you for continually inviting me. It's always a pleasure, Max.
Well, we have great fun. Hey, Rob, I know it's been a wild ride in Washington the last few months when it comes to ATC privatization. We seem to have a couple of major protagonists who've been pushing to privatize ATC. One is Representative Bill Schuster of Pennsylvania, who introduced the 21st Century Aviation Innovation Reform and Authorization Act, or Reauthorization Act. That's a really huge mouthful. And that was looking to try and spin off 30,000 federal employees from the air traffic control into a private nonprofit entity. And of course, the other protagonist has been Bob Poole at the Reason Foundation, who's been pushing ATC privatization for many years. But let's talk first about Representative Schuster. What's up with him?
Well, Representative Schuster has decided to retire at the end of this congressional year, which was a bit of a surprise to some. But what I think was more surprising was that most of the people that I spoke to on the story, because, again, it is one of those things I cover, I think, simply from having spent so many years watching radar screens spin around, they were absolutely positive that Bill Schuster was going to bring the ATC privatization portion of the H.R. 2997 legislation, it was called, back to the floor. And it just shocked everybody, including the people that I talked to that were supporters of privatization.
And so one would have to guess the reason he didn't bring it was because he felt that it wasn't going to pass?
That would be my guess. I don't think anybody that is on their last year wouldn't like to go out with some kind of a big bang And this would have been one of the bigger bangs that Bill Schuster could have made. And again, my guess and the people I've spoken to said they thought he probably had the votes, but apparently not.
Well, I guess the real imperative is they've got to get FAA reauthorization pushed through sometime in the next couple of months. Otherwise, there's not going to be a continuing funding. And perhaps they just split this off, feeling like they'd have to save the main bill and figure out some way to push this through later. When is FAA reauthorization up? How much time do they have to get that done?
Well, not much. About 2 weeks. Authorization dies on March 31st of this year.
Okay, and so they could, I guess, theoretically kick the can down the road like they did, last October or something like that. Maybe that's happened, a couple of times now?
I think everybody's expecting them to kick the can down the road. For some reason, our major transportation industry somehow just doesn't seem to get the respect it deserves, I think. And everybody says, we forgot to deal with that, and let's just keep it going another couple of months.
Right. So that's a lot easier than doing the hard work of putting together the full bill, which has not just authorization for spending, but a lot of directives as to what Congress is telling the FAA that they should be doing in the coming years. And it appears that one of those directives won't be ATC privatization, at least this month. I mean, obviously, things could change again next month.
I think that's absolutely true, Max. If this doesn't come back to bite us again, I would be very, very surprised. I don't think it's going to be in the next year or anything like that. But if we look back over the last, 20 years, what is this? I think the third or the fourth iteration of the attempt to privatize, or as Bob Poole calls it, to corporatize the air traffic control system.
Yes, I was thinking about 20 years, and as I thought back, the first one that I remember was back during the Clinton administration, so that indeed would be 20 years ago. I recall it also came up during the Obama administration. I think this has come up roughly every 8 years by every new administration.
Yeah, and I'm trying to remember, I think that the Bush administration raised the issue. Maybe it never got quite as far as this one, but again, it doesn't really matter. The point is that they really want this to happen, and I think we all get focused on saying no, and I think what we have to be careful of is to realize how the other side is playing it. I was watching a friend of mine's post. Well, I think he's still a friend. A United pilot up on LinkedIn last night that said if it hadn't been for the entrenched GA interests that are trying to maintain the status quo, the effort would have moved forward. And of course, when somebody baits me like that, I just can't resist. And I had to ask really stupid questions like, what were the special interests trying to gain, and what is the status quo that you think we're trying to maintain? Because we are not trying to say that the air traffic control system is just fine the way that it is. Of course, it needs work. I mean, there's as we record this today, I'm writing about a scathing Department of Transportation IG report that came out that took the FAA to task for really blowing a lot of this next gen effort. And we understand that. All that I think that the people like you and I are saying is that why is privatization or corporatization, pulling it away from the FAA, the only way to fix all these problems? And how does corporatization fix all these problems? Because they've pretty much wanted us to take all this on faith.
Well, so let's talk about some of the reasons that we're hearing on both sides. Let's take the position of your airline pilot friend. Why does that side say that this is a good thing to do? Why do they say that this is important? Why do we have to do this?
Well, the going story, apparently, from what I can understand, is that the FAA is a governmental entity. It's too slow, it's too inefficient, and it can't manage the dynamics of a project that is as intense as getting next gen up and running is. Of course, I always think it's interesting, and this is a discussion I know you and I have had, is that the airlines are not equipped for ADS-B at this point, And I don't know that they're going to make it with all of their airplanes by the end of next year, which is the mandate. But no one seems to want to talk about that. The GA field, I mean, BizAv and light aircraft are going to be forced into this with no possibility of a change to the deadline. But the airlines get a break. Why is that if that is so important to making next gen come to be? I don't understand that. And again, I think one of the hardest parts just for me is that when I ask people specifically, okay, tell me how this new corporate structure that can't that not necessarily will be dominated by the airlines, but certainly has a much greater potential to be dominated by the airlines than by anybody representing general aviation or business aviation. Nobody wants to talk. And they say, but beside the fact that it could be dominated by the airlines, and the airlines haven't anteed up for the equipment for their airplanes. We know this is the way to go. And when you ask them why is that, they kind of go off on another tangent. And that's I think that lack of well, let's call it a lack of fact, a lack of detail, just scares the heck out of most everybody that I know because it does me.
And I know we've seen over the last couple of years the reasons for privatization of ATC have shifted continually. It was almost as if they would pull out whatever argument seemed to make the most sense, and if it didn't, it's like, well, let's switch to another one. Now, a lot of people talk about trying to provide a continual stream of funding for next gen, and it came out during the hearings in the House last year. I think it was Representative Peter DeFazio was asking if they were simply to provide, a steady source of funding, would that not solve most of the problems that people are trying to solve with privatization? I think the answer came back rather strongly and resoundingly yes. So that's probably one area where it might help with the planning. But I heard an interesting podcast just this past week. I believe it was on Freakonomics, in which they were talking about the history of large projects. And they talked about how all large projects tend to be over budget and late in terms of being delivered. And there were a couple of different reasons. One was the planning fallacy, where as humans we're just optimistic. Any big project, we always think that it's going to take less time than it really does. Another reason is that people tend to oversell the benefits of large projects and underestimate the costs, simply because that becomes a way to get the project approved and moved ahead. So I think that when we look at next gen, it doesn't really matter whether it's going to be done by the government or done by a private corporation. The history of all large capital projects over $1 billion is that they're always over budget and they take longer than people say they're going to take.
I think that's a really good point. In fact, I heard that show myself, and I was thinking very much the same thing. And so I think it is incumbent upon the people that are calling for corporatization or privatization, and I have to keep bouncing back with that because my friend Bob Poole keeps telling me that it's not privatization. But I often say, well, okay, just so show me the facts, the figures, the anything that proves that this is really going to happen, because this is quite a risk for our side of the industry, and we just come up empty-handed. And then my response is, well, then I guess we're going to just keep fighting.
Yeah, and we looked in our episode 17 with you and I last summer at privatization that's occurred around the world in other places, and there have been problems everywhere, including a bailout in the UK when that group was very short of money, and then other problems in other places around the world. You've danced around this kind of privatization versus corporatization. Let's talk about that. It appears to me that there's been a shift in the terminology in the past year. Correct me if I'm wrong, but hasn't Robert Poole and everybody else been talking about ATC privatization up until just a few months ago?
Well, I think that Bob Poole tells me that everybody's had it wrong forever. So I don't know who started it or how it evolved. But I did an interview with Bob Poole about a week ago, because part of what I was going to do was to interview the players on both sides one-on-one and ask them all pretty much the same questions. And it was quite eye-opening to listen to Bob, because if for people that haven't met Bob Poole, he's probably one of the calmest, nicest guys you'd ever want to meet. And you say, well, gee, how did you get wrapped up in something that has turned into such a political firestorm? But again, Bob is really firm on the fact that it's a corporatization move and not a privatization move. Depending, you'd have to actually see the breakdown of the structure, the way it was outlined in HR 2997 to get the details. But he says that everybody is reading privatization into it because it just sounds juicier. However, both sides have been doing that. So, but what I thought was interesting about the conversation with Bob, and that was probably the one of the final questions I asked him, was I said, tell me something. If let's just say that we all went along with you guys, and this whole new ATC corporation came to be, but the whole idea doesn't work, and this problem falls flat on its face, which is, I said, is it not a possibility? And he said, well, of course it's a possibility. We don't think it's a strong possibility. I said, okay, so what would the plan be? And he said, well, there isn't one. And that's how certain they are that this will work. And of course, as you mentioned earlier, when you spoke about Nats over in the UK, and Nats needed a bailout at one point, and at one point too, the NAV Canada people were short of cash. I mean, they didn't get themselves into quite the same box that Nats did. But the way that they fix it, if there's a financial issue, is to just simply raise the fees that everybody pays. And that's how they get themselves out of the problem. And I think that is exactly what I didn't want to hear. I mean, in the sense of saying, oh, now I feel better about it. That's why I didn't want to vote for this.
And I think if we look at other countries like Canada, for example, I believe it was the Delta Airlines study that said that when the privatized ATC in Canada was running short of money, they had to increase fees. And they said that that actually increased the price of tickets for airline tickets in Canada to the point where Canadians were driving across the border to buy U.S. airline tickets and to start their flights in Buffalo versus Toronto and things like that. And also in Australia, where they've privatized the airports, those projects have become incredibly expensive and have raised airline ticket prices there, and a lot of folks are unhappy with how that's worked out as well. So I think a lot of this gets swept under the carpet and doesn't get really fully discussed in all these arguments. Now, back to privatization versus corporatization. My understanding has always been that privatization is when a government chooses to sell off assets to the highest bidder. And so I would agree by that definition, this is not privatization, though it's been called that for many, many, many years. On the other hand, corporatization, I had to look up. And what I saw there is that is the government once again spinning off assets into a corporation which is controlled and owned by the government, which also doesn't apply in this particular case, because I think the proposal in HR 2997 is to spin this off into a separate corporation which is not owned by the government. Would you agree?
That's absolutely true, the way it was explained to me. And I know where you're going with this question, because how do we give away, I don't know, 40 or $50 billion worth of assets for free to this new organization? And I specifically remember asking Bob, saying, hey, listen, I wish I could start an organization, start a company, and have someone give me all of the infrastructure for free. That would be a great boost to the company. I mean, a lot of places would like to start like that. And his response was that the reason that they're not actually giving them away, they're simply transferring ownership from the FAA to this new organization, and hence it's not really a giveaway, and we just couldn't get any more detailed than that. But the other issue was that Bob mentioned the value of these assets, the buildings, the control towers at some airports, and the en route center buildings are so old that they don't have much value anyway. And I thought, well, what about all those new towers? I mean, here in Chicago, I think we've built three new control towers at O'Hare in the last 10 years alone. And he said, well, yes. So I did manage to catch him, and it wasn't my goal to try to catch him, but I said, well, see, the reason you're him hawing around just a little bit on those topics, that's why we're kind of him hawing around about some of the other aspects of this, because it just doesn't make good financial sense to those of us on the other side. And I don't see anybody on the Bill Schuster side saying much except, trust us, it's going to be fine.
Yeah, so I think that trying to say that this is a transfer of assets and not a giveaway doesn't really make a lot of
Correct.
sense. Isn't a giveaway a transfer? I mean, don't if I give
I,
away something, aren't I transferring it to someone
I,
else?
it sure sounds like it to me, but I think that also people have their talking points kind of set out, and they just kind of keep talking the same talking points and saying, well, if I keep saying this long enough, people will start to believe it.
Yes, I think right now we're really getting into semantics. It's not privatization because corporatization sounds better. It's not a giveaway because transferring sounds better. So yeah, I think there's a kind of a shifting of the language to try and help continue to push this concept. Let's get back to your airline captain friend. One of the things we have heard is that the airlines are really looking to try and fix what they perceive as being a problem in the Northeast. Let's talk about that.
I think that's a really interesting point because whenever they talk about the need to corporatize the air traffic control system, they talk about how the current system is just so old and so antiquated and so slow in being updated that the airlines are experiencing unbelievable delays across the Northeast, especially, which is probably the tightest chunk of airspace we have here in the United States. But the one part that they seem to completely forget is that most of the delays that the airlines experience are either one, due to weather, which has nothing to do with the air traffic control system, or two, the airline's own scheduling techniques. Everybody wants to leave LaGuardia at 9 a.m. and it just doesn't work. And multiply that across JFK, LaGuardia, Newark, Boston, Dulles, Reagan, and but again, that has never been an issue. That has never been a topic I have heard addressed in any of these discussions about corporatizing the air traffic control system. How even if we had it working, even if the airlines had the equipment on their airplanes, how that is still not going to fix the problem of the way the airlines book their, or I should say, how the airlines schedule their airplanes.
Yes, in fact, I think the key argument for this privatization of ATC is that, wow, we've got massive delays, and this somehow is going to magically solve all those delays. And as you point out, very few of them are related to ATC. I think what I often hear is that we're short of runways. We need more concrete. That's certainly the case with some of the really large airports where they're just kind of maxed out. They need additional runways, and
Well, can I add one thing, though, that I think is really important? We're talking about this because you and I are longtime GA people and we're both flight instructors. You know, the thing that we always miss is that if this corporation were to come to be and something didn't go the way it was supposed to, and they raise the rates on us, they're going to raise the rates on the airlines as well, and airline passengers are going to feel the pinch. And the way it has been proposed was only to mention how antiquated the system is and how much it needs to be updated and how it can't be under the current FAA. But they never mention, oh, and by the way, if this doesn't go well, everybody's price to fly is going to go up.
Exactly. Yeah, and back to scheduling delays, I think a couple of things that people never discuss is that in the 90s we did not have a Commerce Department giving their on-time arrival rates, and clearly airlines have scheduled so that they can show better on-time arrival rates, which means they've padded the schedules a little bit by adding a few extra minutes. And so this argument that an airplane from Chicago to Washington now takes 15 minutes longer to get there, doesn't really take into account that the airlines are purposely trying to make their on-time arrival scores look better, and that the aircraft that we fly now are slower than the aircraft that we flew 30 years ago. And that's because every time you take a 737 and you make it longer, it becomes a slower aircraft. Plus, the airlines have been flying a little bit slower to save fuel because fuel got expensive. So, yeah, all this stuff kind of gets swept aside and, is not really mentioned.
Well, that's really true. And again, I think the key is that to your listeners, be ready. It's coming back at some point in some form. We just don't know what yet, but be ready and trust me, it is something that people do need to contact their congressional members about. And as my airline friend mentioned, the legislators were just absolutely overwhelmed by the amount of outreach from the GA and business aviation community. And honestly, it proved that the system worked because they packed it in for now.
Yes, and it was just a couple of months ago we were told that there was not a path through the Senate for ATC privatization. People assumed that they would be able to get it through the House, but apparently when they counted votes here in the last few weeks, they decided that path didn't exist in the House either. And I think a lot of that has to do with representatives in both houses of Congress who are coming from rural areas. I think it's largely assumed that if ATC privatization occurred and if they did everything possible to try and optimize air traffic flow into the three major airports in and out of New York, as well as the other East Coast airports, Boston, Washington, that would come at the expense of smaller airports in more rural areas. And frankly, when you fly across this country, I've got to tell you, this country is empty. It is made up of rural areas. And I think those votes are going to make it very difficult to get this through Congress legislatively. Do you think there's another way that they could try and push through privatization without going through Congress?
We've talked about that before, you and and I guess I would never want to say never. I don't know how Congress works or doesn't work, but I, I would not be surprised if someone figured out that, gee, we've tried this the same way 3 or 4 times and we've gotten nowhere, and to try to make an end run some other way. I don't know what it is. I have a feeling that we'll know it when we see it, but I can't even begin to imagine how they might try that. But I have my antenna up.
Yes, I agree. I think that's the thing that we need to be looking for is an end run. I think the folks who are trying to push ATC privatization or corporatization are going to figure out that it hasn't worked going through Congress, and they're going to try and either create a more attractive version of this bill to send through Congress, or they're going to try and find some way to perhaps get it done executively, through the executive branch of government or something like that. So I think the key message to everyone is, stand by, because this story is not over. This story is not dead. And there are going to be future calls again from AOPA and MBAA and EAA to contact your representatives in Congress. And when those emails come out, I would encourage everybody to do just that.
Well, and one final point I would make is that I was out in Boston last week, and I spent part of the day with some other journalists, quite a few of whom were from Europe. And at lunch, I sat with a fellow from Germany, a fellow from the UK, and another fellow from Austria. And the one thing that they all spoke about was this privatization issue, and they said, oh boy, you guys do not realize how good you have it over there. I know you'd probably have people that are tired of listening to, people like you and pump this up and say we've got to fight this. But they said you should see what it costs to make a flight in a Cirrus in Germany, for instance. It is so expensive, you cannot even imagine it. This is your opportunity to stop that camel from getting its nose under the tent. And trust me, if you don't, you are going to be so sorry.
Yes, we hear that continually from other folks who are flying in other parts of the world of how great we have it and how difficult and how expensive it is in those parts of the world. And the other thing I don't think ever really gets discussed is that where ATC has been privatized, and it's really only a couple places in the world, that the amount of air traffic that they deal with is minuscule compared to what's proposed here in the United States. We have a massive amount of air traffic compared to Canada, compared to the UK. And for example, a lot of the differences in Canada would be that they end up being able to subsidize the cost of ATC for domestic aircraft within the country by the fees that they charge the huge number of airlines that are flying across the Atlantic. And here in the U.S., we don't have that kind of opportunity to subsidize. So the people who are flying domestically here in the U.S. would bear the full burden of the cost of ATC.
That's correct. And remember what you just said about the people flying across the U.S., not just the GA BizAv group, but everybody. And of course, the one thing we have not talked about is how would the U.S. military pay its fair share for this new corporatized system? I don't think I ever really heard that discussed.
Well, clearly this is an ongoing saga. I think privatization is going to be the storyline that continues throughout our entire lives. And so I think for GA pilots, those of us who feel that this is not going to be in our best interest, just stay vigilant. Isn't that the message we want to communicate?
Oh, I think that's absolutely it. And that's why I'm glad that you're talking on Aviation News Talk and I'm writing at Flying, because we're both very passionate about this, but I'm also very passionate about making certain that people understand both sides of the story. Because I think only if we can sit down with the people one by one on both sides and ask them essentially the same questions and then match all that up, can anybody really make a good decision. Otherwise, it's just a bit of hysterics at times.
Yeah, I think that's probably incredibly important. And I think you do a great job of that, because if we're just talking past each other and not listening and trying to understand people's points of view, it's really hard to not just be yelling at a blank TV screen. We really need dialogue to move forward.
Well, that's true, and let's be serious. We've kind of turned into a country of extremes. You're all the way on the left, or you're all the way on the right, and the moderates are kind of getting lost in the mess. They're getting lost in the mix, I think, and I think also that sometimes the moderates just say, I don't want to get in the middle of all that craziness, and they just don't say anything, and that's not any good either.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you so much for coming here today and giving us an update on what you're seeing in privatization as you talk with different folks involved with it in various aspects. Tell me, where can people find you if they want to find out more about Rob Mark and the work you're doing these days?
Well, I think I'm more interested in them finding out about the work than I am about me, because I'm getting very old and tomorrow's my birthday, but I am not going to tell anybody how old I am. So the best place to look is either in the pages of Flying Magazine, which is, of course, available on the newsstand, or flyingmag.com, or at jetwine.com. And oh wait, there is that other thing. The Airplane Geeks. I'm part of that crew as well, as are you. So they can find the two of us hashing it out for the GA BizAv side at the Airplane Geeks.
That's right, airplanegeeks.com. And, I had a big note here right after I introduced you to say happy birthday, and I blew it. So,
well, that's okay.
Rob, I want to wish you a big happy birthday. And I know that that's the reason you're not going to be on this week's episode of Airplane Geeks, because you're headed out for a special dinner. So I hope you enjoy that.
Well, thank you. And I have to admit that turning 40 is different than I expected.
Good. Well, I'll look forward to hearing all about that.
Thanks for having me on, Max.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Well, I hope you enjoyed the show. And just a quick reminder that I specialize in Cirrus. So if you're thinking of buying a new or slightly used Cirrus, please contact me now so I can help you a little bit more with that process. And if you're considering a new Cirrus, let me help set up a free demo flight for you. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people literally around the world. And by the way, if you enjoy this show, please show your friends how to find this podcast. And if they're not familiar with just what a podcast is, have them go to the Apple App Store and download our dedicated app, which you can find by searching for Aviation News Talk. Until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.